I feel, and a lot of you feel, fairly comfortable around snow and exploration kinds of things, but as I introduce our speaker, I feel somewhat like the fellow who went to heaven and he had witnessed the Jamestown flood. And all he wanted to talk about is he wanted to give a talk about the Jamestown flood. On and on and on. So finally, one night, St. Peter said, okay, I'll let you talk about the Jamestown flood, but just remember, Noah is in the audience. So with that, I introduce Peter Fuchs.
First time I've been called Noah.
When you walk on water, it's just frozen.
Sometimes I feel under real false pretenses because it's living off the back of my father, but I've had a lot of fun since the beginning of the 21st century. Shall we say, following in his footsteps. I've been down to the Antarctic as the field course part of a university postgrad from Christchurch University in New Zealand. And so that was one time. The following year I went with my son to the peninsula and visited all the old British bases. And you'll see one of where my father was, but it's false pretenses because I'm living on the back of it, but it's been quite an experience. And this one really tops it off. Quite a thrill to come here, or at least to find out that rock and roll was being restored. I got the message via New Zealand and got in touch with Scott here, and the deal was done instantly. It's great to be here. Now, the plan is to give you a presentation which is centered on the expedition, the first crossing of Antarctica, and showing more of Sno-cats and what they went through than necessarily the whole of the expedition, but I'll tell you the story there. And after that, we have a small presentation to make, and then there is a presentation that is really aimed at the children. It's animals in the Arctic versus animals in the Antarctic. Some great pictures, and some of the Arctic ones I haven't seen, but all the Antarctic ones I took myself. So we've got that, and then we can go on and it's up to everyone else. So it's fluid evening. Right. So I suppose I should start. I was 15 when, not when the expedition planning started. I was younger than that. And I was, in a sense, brought up with it and heard all the traumas. My father at the time had been down south in the Antarctic after the Second World War, and had been the field leader for about 10 bases down there, and they were all science, and it was right at the beginning of what has emerged to being worldwide science program to find out how the world is reacting to climate warming. And it is absolutely of absolute importance that research in the Antarctic goes on. It's also used as the proving ground for space equipment, Mars landers and that sort of thing. Not specifically, but people trial equipment and how it survives in up to -60. So that's pretty important. So, where was I going? I was going, my involvement in the planning, or my listening to it, my father battling against people resisting, he had come back from his first trip to the Antarctic to run a science bureau in London, and he'd had this idea when sitting down at the bottom of the peninsula. And really, I'm racing on a bit, but setting the scene. He was wondering now what it was like further on into the continent. And nobody in 1950 had been on the ground in the center of the Antarctic. Okay, sure, Ellsworth had flown from the peninsula over to Little America in various stages, but and people had in the heroic age had gone from the New Zealand side to the South Pole, but that was just about it, a bit round the fringes on the Pacific side of the Antarctic. Anyway, I think we should get going a bit here. So this is just to reorientate you all. Last night I asked the question, who's been to the Antarctic, and I got one hand. So I think we need a bit of general introduction to the Antarctic. So we've got, I always refer to it as the New Zealand side and the South American side, and by that I mean, hey, where's that gone? For example, no, it happened then.
It won't show on there.
Oh, it's a screen. Yeah, never mind. Okay. Who was that?
I've never seen that film.
Can I borrow it?
I don't think mine will show. It's the first button. Try it and see if it'll show on there.
No, it doesn't. Okay. Small technical hitch. You have to use your imaginations. Anyway, so my first trip was to the.
In back it's a little.
Bit quiet, is it? No? Oh, you get my. Okay. My first trip was to the Ross Sea, down on the base where all the heroic age expeditions went. And then, as I said, the following year I went to the Antarctic Peninsula. And you can see up there Alexander Island. Well, there's it was around there that my father was first in the Antarctic. And, you will be seeing more maps. And we are traveling from the head of the Weddell Sea with the expedition base there, all the way across to the Ross Sea. Now, the Antarctic is an absolute desert. You don't think of it like that. It's a desert because all the moisture falls out of the skies, fine snow crystals, and that's how the ice cap, which is up to 10,000 plus feet thick, has accumulated. And there we have it as the highest, coldest, driest, windiest desert in the world. And you have to think of gravity and the ice falling from the atmosphere, and the moisture having been transported from the tropics, and it falls on the ground, gets consolidated, and then under gravity the desert starts moving. It moves seawards, and you have these enormous glaciers spreading out towards the coast. And then they create these huge ice shelves. For instance, the Ross Sea is as big as France. The Ross Sea ice shelf is as big as France. And the one at the head of the Weddell Sea is of similar size. So it's a real wild place. And as I say to people, you don't get to the proper Antarctic until you're beyond 70 degrees south. Then it becomes cold and you have to respect it, or you're going to be dead in a short time. So we have here mountains, probably the top 2,000 foot of the mountains, but they will be anything from 10 to 14,000 feet in height. So that illustrates the depth of the ice. Icebergs we think of, well, you may never think of them really, but this one, the important thing in the sea is that 80% of them are below the water. So you don't want to get too close because the water's what melts the ice and then they turn turtle. Okay, that's it. But they can be very big indeed. And this one, B15, it's not so easy here because I don't know the mileages, but if I'm in London down at Beaufort Island, I live up at the top of the picture, 100 miles further north from London. So that's quite a thing. And I might say that's only part of the iceberg that broke off the Ross Sea ice shelf. They slowly break up, but this particular one changed the whole physical situation on the coast for all the animals. The penguins had that much further to go to get feed and everything through the winter. The emperor penguins that nest during the cold winter. And so they can have a serious effect, but eventually they float off out into the Pacific or whichever ocean it is. Now there's a picture of quite a small glacier. It's about 5 miles wide and probably 100 miles long, not by no means the biggest. Then moving over to the peninsula side, which is where global warming is having a really big effect, you have a much more broken picture. The ocean currents are swirling around in a clockwise direction, and they abut against the peninsula and break all the ice that forms up, whether it be the bigger icebergs coming from the ice shelves, or indeed the sea ice that forms around the continent in the winter and makes the continent about 3 times larger than it is normally. So that's a nice calm picture. Another one, that's a question of spot the 5,000-ton icebreaker. That sort of gives it a, it's off just below the really dark black rock. But that's a very typical summer picture of the peninsula, and that would have been at about 70 degrees south. And then you have, this is actually the Fuchs Piedmont, which a Piedmont is a huge accumulation of ice that is basically on land, but is buried. But that's just gives you further feel for what the peninsula is like. Now this is the base where my father first was after the, just after the Second World War. The whole British operation was created as a wartime protection of the harbours, that natural harbours on the peninsula, to prevent them being used by German raiders. And the operation was a naval one, and they set up during the last 2 years of the war a couple of bases on the peninsula. And after the war, it became civilian, and that's when, as far as the Brits were concerned, the proper science, the permanent science program began. At the time it was called the Falkland Islands Dependency Survey. But the base huts were pretty primitive. In fact, some of them were Armco type huts, or Nikson huts we call them in Britain. This was the gang of 11 who spent 2 years there. Some of them had spent 3 winters at this base, and my father was only scheduled to be there for one winter, and then the relief boat couldn't come in. This lot became known as the Lost 11, and I was at the time, I remember doing a radio broadcast aged 8. No, I didn't do a radio broadcast. I read out a message as a nervous 8-year-old, and that was part of a program from the BBC to entertain these guys. Anyway, that's by the way. There's a picture of my father in those days. How old would he have been then? 1948. Well, he'd be 40. And the rest of them would have been in their 20s. So he was not only known as Bunny all his life, but he was, yeah, God. You know, having a senior moment, what they called him. Anyway, it wasn't the boss, and it wasn't Dad, but it's something like that. Sorry about that. And that is the boat that couldn't get in, the John Biscoe, an ex-US mine-laying vessel, quite small. And they did use were starting to use aeroplanes, although this one crashed early on and they weren't, didn't have much use. But the point of me showing this picture is to make you realize that in those days, everything took a long time to get down there. Expeditions were 3 years long, in the case of TAE, and you'd send down the advance party to arrive down south in the summer, build the bases, get sorted out, and by the time you'd done that it was winter, dark, for 3-4 months, depending on what latitude, and then you would start doing your work the following summer. And so everything took a long time. These days, well, certainly the British scientists, they climb aboard the plane, fly out to Punta Arenas in Chile, catch another plane, they fly straight into a base on the peninsula, and then they go further on into the field. And they will do their work over just 2 or 3 months instead of 2 or 3 years. So it was remote in my father's day, big time. This is the replacement hut for what you saw earlier, but in the background is the American base, which was put up by Finn Ron's expedition in the early 40s. And I just thought I'm going to be introducing a bit of American-orientated stuff. It's all right. It may be a bit boring because it is Brit-orientated, but there we go. And that's me signing the visitors book at Stonington. 55 years, plus or minus a couple of days, since my father closed the base in 1950. It was reopened and the new base, which I showed you, was then shown. But I didn't realize it was 55 years later, almost to the day, until quite a while later, which is extraordinary. That's my son. I don't know why that's in there, but it is. There were no Sno-cats. This is the way they traveled. So you'd have a team of 9 husky dogs pulling a sledge with a lot of husky food and a lot of human food, a tent or two, and equipment. And but it had limitations. You couldn't go that far. And in the blizzard down the bottom end of the peninsula, my father and his colleague were, you know, they told each other their life stories, and then they suddenly had a bright idea, where do we go from here, in a scientific sense? And they thought, well, we need an expedition to go into the center of Antarctica. And that was the initial thought and the start of TAE. So we come on to TAE, that's the expedition map. The red line from at the top side of the picture, Basel Bay at the head of the Weddell Sea, Shackleton was the base they built. They built that. They left London in November 1955, arriving at the head of the Weddell Sea after a seriously prolonged voyage, because they got stuck in the ice like Shackleton, and they were pretty lucky to get out. But they arrived there at the Weddell Sea about a month late, and they just had time to offload everything. And the 8 men who were the advance party people had a pretty rough winter, and we're just coming on to that. Before we get there, there's an emperor penguin colony that they suddenly came across on their trip to the head of the Weddell Sea. And these days, you have a satellite, and you look for all the poo on the ice. And that's where the colony is, or will be the next winter. It's simple when you've got a satellite sitting here. There's the Canadian sealer, the Theron, stuck in the Weddell Sea ice, small vessel, and they had aboard an Oster float plane, a float and ski plane, and that would take off from the pools in the ice and find the best route to get out of it. And it was also used for the initial aerial surveys to see where they were going. And they found mountains, big mountains. This is the Shackleton Range. In front you can see a glacier, so it's a pretty big one. And then all the striations in the foreground of the picture are crevasses. So as you go in to the continent from the coast, you're climbing all the time, and you're climbing against the flow of the ice, and you're having to negotiate all the crevasses, which can be, and you'll see, be quite dangerous. As you get in further in, the mountains are getting covered, and you just have the peaks sticking out. This is the Nunatak. Well, they're called Nunataks after the Arctic Eskimo language, and these are which way Nunataks, because the question was, which way do we go? They had never been there. And then, you know, when you're sitting there frozen, you're not too inventive with your names. So, we got to the advance party. Oh, hell. Yeah, oh, yeah, yes. The advance party, we're going to build this. In fact, they did build it. That's the frame of the main Shackleton base. And that was buried inside just a few months. And that's because the katabatic winds come down from the central plateau, and they create the serious blizzards. You can track the katabatic winds. They come in pulses, and these days you can track them by radar. And it's the sheer weight of the heavy, cold air from the center of the plateau. And so you have streams of ice and streams of cold katabatic wind coming from inside. And if you leave anything out, it gets buried very quickly. And these 8 men, they lived in the crate that the first Sno-cat that went down had been transported in, the county of Kent. It's the only one that we don't have with us these days. But these 8 men went through hell. You think about it, they didn't have room to sleep in the crate, so they slept out in their tents, which they had to dig out regularly. You know, you could easily, it's one of the ways people die, is that if they don't dig out their tents. And these days they use small mountaineering tents that get covered a lot easier. You just suffocate the air, there isn't any air. So you have to be very aware of what's going on around you. And they went through the winter. You have the Aurora Borealis down there, fantastic. And the Theron had meantime returned to London, and disappeared, and the final planning process went through, and a new boat, the Magadan, which a Danish vessel, had been built, and this was her maiden voyage, rather bigger than the Theron. I think the Theron was about 1,000 tons, and this was 2.5. So a big improvement. Got there quite quickly, and the second winter began. They'd done a bit of reconnaissance for the journey as well as for science, but the winter starts, well, I said 3 or 4 months. It's pretty dark by April. By May, it's pitch dark until the end of August. So there's not much you can do except undercover. Anyway, there are the line of Sno-cats, the 4 Sno-cats, A for Able, B for rock and roll, C for Hayward, and the County Kent, not there. Probably behind the photographer, but anyway. This is a picture, they had overwintered and they're beginning to get them going in September 1957. So we started November 55. Over the next year, did the advance party. A year later, November 56, the main party leave. We're doing almost another year, and you're starting planning your journey. And the first thing was to find the reconnaissance, the route to the forward base that they had built at 4,000 feet, called South Ice. And this is a picture of the reconnaissance team leaving, and I think it is with, I'm sure it's with the County of Kent in the rear. 2 weasels, 3 weasels. One weasel broke down after about 15 miles and had to return. But a journey of 300 miles, expected to take about a month, took rather longer than that, almost 40 days. And as you will see, well, there's the picture. Shackleton Base there, and this. You'll see right at the top there, beside the first depot, there's a huge ice chasm. And I'll talk to that in a moment when we come on to what sort of science we're doing. But the point of this map is to show you the crevasse field areas they had to get through and why it took so long. Because the reconnaissance journey was fine. It was colder. It was the start of the summer, but still there were disasters. Not necessarily for the first Sno-cat to cross a crevasse, which might be certainly as wide as this room and big enough to take any church you're thinking of with the big ones. They're enormous, and they slowly narrow. But this is a picture of County of Kent on the left and Able pulling out rock and roll. This is actually on the main journey. And I know it's rock and roll, although you can't see it because it was Hayward. It was Hayward that went on the reconnaissance journey. And this is the first picture. But every time a Sno-cat or any vehicle fell into a crevasse, there was a different way of getting them out. And of course they tried to prevent it, and this is a picture merely to illustrate that they would have to start probing for the crevasses, and they came across a shallow depression. It was a sure sign of the crevasse, and wanted to see how big it was, and so they used canes to see what the depth of the surface snow/ice was. And this is them having arrested my father and his deputy leader, Stratton. And then the weasels would have their own experiences. That is Rumble. George Lowe, who was the photographer, he was always very keen on his weasel. He got it as far as the pole, and you see a picture of him. His weasel was called Rack and Ruin. Pleased to hear that. Tucker family will be pleased to hear that. So that's yeah, that's David Pratt in rock and roll. Difficult to get out of sometimes when you suspended over nothing. And as I said, there are different ways of getting vehicles out. Fill the crevasse up, put in your aluminium struts and drive it out. And I might say that there were occasions when the cat would haul itself out just on its front tracks. So that was a big advantage. And one of the things that was attractive to people was the fact that the independently driven pontoons, that might not be the right description, Tucker family, but they would operate in that way. Well, you know, caught by the back and the tow bar and all that. They'd be towing sledges of fuel, up to 5 or 6 tons of fuel behind them. And this picture is the South Ice, buried of course, but in this small hut, 3 men survived the winter, did their glaciological work, studying the ice. Weather was always important to understand what the climate was like. And before they set off on the main journey, people have been into the mountains and doing geological and survey work. And this is a picture of the de Havilland otter at the Theron Mountains. And that, although it doesn't show up, because the definition is so good, but there's huge coal seams in that mountain. Well, one hopes that they will never be worked, because it would be very costly, and in a way we don't not too keen on coal, are we? The plane would fly in dot teams, and the geologists and surveyors would be out for probably a month before meeting up at South Ice to join the main crossing party. And the crossing party, when going across the plateau, were doing a seismic traverse to establish the depth of the ice. Not been done before. People were aware, and expeditions on the coast had trialled equipment to record the depth of ice, but it's exactly the same technology as oil prospecting. Nothing extraordinary. But it was going to be the very first seismic traverse of the continent. And I mentioned the chasm, and I mention it in a science sense because they couldn't understand why that was there. I was quite a long way inland, and the only conclusion was that it was due to the rise and fall of the tide beneath the ice shelf that slowly flexed the whole area, and in the end this would break off, or the ice shelf would break off along this line as one enormous area of, one enormous iceberg. Now you might be asking, well, where is it now? I'm afraid I can't answer that question. Anyway, just before we get on to the main party, the de Havilland Otter was the first single-engine plane to fly from one side of the continent to the other. And this is a picture as they're flying down the Beardmore Glacier on the New Zealand side of the South Pole, virtually home and dry, but they had several attempts. They'd filled the fuselage of the plane with flexible fuel tanks, and they needed it. They arrived with only about 20 minutes of fuel left. So about a month, or, well, rather about a fortnight later than they expected, the team flew back to Shackleton and the main crossing started. And they had to go through exactly the same troubles with crevasses because the summer had come, the crevasse bridges had weakened, and they kept falling in again. So that's what you'd seen in the pictures earlier. And they got to South Ice just before Christmas 1957 and stayed there for a couple of days to recover, had their Christmas dinner, and they were off. That's the gap that I understand. Right, so that's the ice cap. And give you a closer view, and you can see, all right, rock and roll, County of Kent over on the County of Kent is the one with the windows on the side. And the other, that's just a campsite up on the plateau. And well, another one, just to give you, you can see how the wind drives it. It might be a beautiful sunny day, but you can't see very much because the blizzard is, what, 10 foot tall? And it's, you know, white out on the surface. And eventually, so they left Christmas, they struggled with the sastrugi, and eventually they were heading for the South Pole Station, the American South Pole Station, which is what it looked like in January the 19th, 1958. Always a debate which day they arrived. If you're a Brit, it's the 19th, and if you're a New Zealander, it's the 20th. Why?
Dateline.
Ah, good man. Dateline. Yeah, that's right. So there's George Lowe's Rack and Ruin. Yeah. Run round the barrel circle. You've gone round the world in however fast you've run. And they issued certificates. I got my father's certificate. Passed around the world in 3 minutes. And that's the crossing party. I won't go through the name, but the important fellow right at the ear's end is the chief engineer who was responsible for choosing the Sno-cats as the main vehicle for the expedition, and being over here, David Pratt, and where's my father? Oh, my father's in the front with the white boots. And I will put on, yes, I'll give you a surprise later. Take note. Brit on the right, father, in his gear, a whaler's cap with at the temple, a bit of elastoplast to, do you know what I mean by elastoplast? Oh, patches you put on cuts on your hand, body. Anyway, it was white. And Ed Hillary, famed for getting to the top of Everest, of course, and many other things. And also being a pain in the neck. sorry, Hillary.
I didn't hear that.
No, we can go in, I won't go into it now, but you might be interested to hear the controversy that happened in the middle of this time. But anyway, we have Ed Hillary on the left, my father in the centre, and Admiral Dufek, who headed up Operation Deep Freeze for the Americans at the time of IGY. IGY International was the first time that internationally people had got together to do a major science program throughout the world. I mean, there had been years before that, even into the 19th century. But my father's expedition had in fact been delayed time and was extremely helpful to the expedition. I mean, really helpful. He helped the New Zealand people find a proper base stop at the the site of Scott Base, which is actually only just over the hill from McMurdo Sound, McMurdo Base, which is the Americans' main Antarctic base. Anyway, full note, the American support for the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition. So, they left the pole with 1,200 miles to go. They'd only done about 800. So that was certain pressure. Heading for Scott Base and a boat to take them home. And the boat would have to leave really by... The New Zealand Support Party had created depots, mainly for fuel, yes, entirely for fuel, all the way to... And this is the picture of the southernmost depot that the New Zealanders built. And of course Ed Hillary went on Ferguson tractors, and that was nothing to do with the expedition plan, but everything to do with his ego. We can go into more detail if you want. But this is just a picture of the New Zealand de Havilland Crossing Party, and show them where they had found crevasses, made the journey very much quicker. So I just show that again. We've arrived, you see where Beermore Glacier is? Well, just like where the red line is, underneath Beardmore Glacier, is where that depot is, approximately. And they were following what appears to be the margin of the Ross ice shelf, southwards, no, northwards. Everything's north. Following down the picture, a big mountain range with the New Zealanders have been surveying and doing geology in and all that sort of thing. And the ice cap is held back behind the mountain chain and only travels down the valleys as glaciers. And the Beardmore Glacier is said to be the largest in the world, and well, it's the one up which Scott and Shackleton went towards the South Pole. Anyway, they were travelling down the backside to a position where they knew they could get the tractors down, and the black line shows the trip down the Skelton Glacier, and the Plateau Depot was the first one that was up there on the ice shelf, and they were heading for Scott Base. Now, Ross Island is where all the heroic age expeditions huts are. Those who that's another story in itself, but they're virtually home and dry, as it were. And this is a picture of Mount Higgins, whichever cat is this? Oh, the county of Kent, coming down the Skelton Glacier. And this is another, this picture is, shall we say, well, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best. And in fact, my son has it about that size up in his kitchen room. He had it reproduced from an ordinary 35mm colour slide, which was a remarkable bit of technology. But anyway, what it shows is how the weather conditions are at ground level, and you can see the blue sky above. And of course they were having to do their regular maintenance, greasing those 250 grease nipples on each pontoon. 298, I mean. yeah, Tucker, so... yeah. But, you know, it wasn't simple. There were all sorts of mechanical incidents on the way, which were really quite serious, with the drive mechanism breaking away from its mountings and various things like that. But this picture illustrates what the mechanics were having to go through to re-weld things in, well, when it was out in the wind, it'd be easily down to -30. A different way of working. from your nice, comfortable, clean garage. Just a pretty picture down on the Ross Ice Shelf. There was one incident because, of course, the Americans knew they were coming, and well, and of course the New Zealand support party knew they were coming, and the planes came up, and everyone was busily watching the planes, and one of the Sno-cats had stopped, and the other one just drove up the sledge behind it. What was in the sledge? All the detonators for all the seismic work. So there could have been disaster just within the last day. But you know, another thing about right at the end, they had to schedule their arrival so the world's press could attend. So it was, in a sense, the 99 days that it took against the planned 100 could have been quite a bit less. Anyway, there they are. I recognise that, the background to that, because they're just driving into Scott Base, round the corner on the left of the picture. Flags flying, streamers going, to be met by quite a reception party. And there was, of course, there were the New Zealanders and a lot of Americans, and the Americans had organised a welcome and a band, and it doesn't matter if you can play as long as you play loud. And there, that's Scott Base. Let's just show you what it was like in those times. And there's the band practicing, and there they are playing. So, you know, you can't expect a bearded gentleman being down there for a long time. Had no music lessons, probably. Play a good tune. I understand that. The version of God Save the Queen was not very good. Anyway, well, the next pictures I'm going to show you is what happened at the end, because throughout this period, here am I as a 16, 17-year-old, and in the papers, the national papers back in the UK, it was news every single day, and you just got used to it. I mean, I was away at school and pretty divorced from it. But when you think back, it was quite extraordinary that the expedition with its controversies held the interest of the public for so long. And that's why I'm showing just a couple of slides about the aftermath when they landed back in England, because they got back to New Zealand and went through all sorts of receptions and parties and whatever, and my mother and father went off for a holiday a bit, and then they got aboard a liner and took about, I don't know how many weeks, 4, 5. We went down there on a special train, and we came back to London on a special train, and that's what that picture. Any French here? We have lots of things like that. Oh, sense of humour. Anyway, big reception, and that just illustrated there was a cavalcade of cars. There was one of my father's friends had this enormous Rolls Royce, and that was the first one in the picture there. But my point is that the expedition had been public. The public had contributed money, significant money. Probably 2,000 schools contributed, maybe just, you know, a fiver to feed a dog for a month, but it was getting people involved. It was a private expedition, seriously funded by the public, and of course supported UK, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. So it was the last scientific private expedition that's been, yes, until the Fuchs Foundation sent 4 teachers into the mountains at the head of the Weddell Sea. Now, I'm not quite sure that's true, but I like to think of it like that. Might talk about that later. So, some pictures. Where are the sno-cats today? Well, this is Hayward, Sno-cat Sea, arriving back in the UK. The New Zealanders had taken Abel, and that is in a museum in Christchurch. Survived the earthquake, fortunately, undamaged. This is Hayward, which is with the Science Museum of London, and in fact stored on an airfield in a huge hangar with other amazing things, which Scott and Bill here saw last month. No, not last month. This month. Was it March? Anyway, it's there. It's been on display. It comes in and out, and its story is quite extraordinary. It's worth just spending a moment telling you that. Having been taken around the country by BP as part of their publicity after the event, the expedition had finished, it was passed to a motor museum in the south of the country. I can't tell you, but shall we say a decade or two, and it was climbed over, and it was getting worse and worse. It was out in the open all the time, and although we don't get snow like you do, we get some pretty bad weather. And in the end, the motor museum decided they had to get rid of it. So they sold it to a scrap man. And the scrap man came to pick it up. He was on a low loader, driving down towards his scrapyard. Another fellow coming the other way saw it, knew exactly what it was, turned around, chased him, hauled him over, and bought it there on the spot. And he was like so many of you here, enthusiasts for sno-cats. And he spent years restoring it to some sort of condition, and showed it around places, but it never actually travelled. And he eventually gave it to the Science Museum. And that's just a brilliant story, I think, but not as good as actually restoring rock and roll and driving it up to the hut this morning. That's just to show a very bad picture, but that's Hayward, and he travelled around and that, I think, is the end of this part of the presentation.